So I do.
I mean, sometimes I feel like we're on the same 5-year schedule. And at the center of the way that makes great to see everybody. Whether you don't want to listen to me, we're going to start. Hey, since I can't give anyone a bad grade, there's no way for me to make you be quiet, so I'll just talk. It's so wonderful to see so many people here on a Saturday afternoon thirsting for more education. It's kind of incredible. I know that I should remember everybody's names, but you don't have name tags, and so I probably am going to fail on that dimension spectacularly. But it is really wonderful to have so many alums back in the building and seeing our beautiful new building and catching up with what the school's doing. My name is Fiona Scott Morton. I teach in Extension. I've been at Yale since '99, so I probably taught to join faculty. Some of you anyway. I teach competitive strategy, and lately I've been teaching a new elective called Competition Economics and Policy. This Competition Economics and Policy is that class is essentially an advanced strategy class. I require students to take competition economics, and then we take the strategy all the way to the edge of legal and then across the legal boundary, and we talk about the antitrust laws, and we cover cartels and collusion and mergers and monopolization, not from the perspective of law, but from the perspective of the manager and the consumer. And I get a lot of students in there who are quite interested in the welfare of the consumer, because this is SOM and I have great students. And I also have a few undergrads in that class and a bunch of law students in that class. So that's my latest teaching adventure, and that has led me to more work on digital platforms, because that's an area where we have failed in antitrust enforcement. We're trying now to catch up after a decade or so of not doing anything. And the result of that is that we both have big challenges on the antitrust front and also on the regulation front, so I thought I'd just tell you a bit about that. And as usual, please just raise your hand if you have a question or I'm going too fast or something. And if it's too off topic, I'll just say let's talk about it afterwards, but otherwise I'm sure other people will be interested in the same things you're interested in. Okay, so away we go. How do we characterize digital platforms from the economics perspective? They often have low or zero marginal cost. So marginal cost of delivering another search or another hotel listing or a post on a social network is pretty much zero. There are big economies of scope. If I have a bunch of people buying toasters, I can get them to sign up for, I can give them some video content for free also, or part of the same package. There is often strongly increasing returns to data. I know where you are, so I can answer your question better, so I can serve you a better ad. And the more data piles on top of the initial data, the better I can do that. And then very often these platforms have network externalities. We all want to be on the same platform everybody else is on, because that makes the traffic predictions better, or I can email more people, or I can message more people, or I can I don't know, share my vacation with more people. So that makes these platforms prone to tipping, just in the way other network industries were prone to tipping, which we've taught here for many decades. So starting with the singles bar and the phone network. I mean, it's not, you don't want to be the only person on a new phone network who you're going to call. That's pretty terrible. So we all want to be on the same phone network. And if there were two of them, the one that had the most people would attract people from the other one, and pretty soon it would have tipped. Okay? So when you have all of these things going at the same time, what you end up with is a concentrated market structure, and that means you've got large firms. And it means that the competition that we tend to see is, rather than head-to-head competition in the market, you get competition what we call for the market. So we're going to compete to be the winner of the social network game. We're going to compete to be the winner of the search game. We're going to compete to be the winner of the... Oh, you're taking pictures here. I need to sit down. Okay. That we do see some of these markets that can sustain multiple firms, like Uber and Lyft. Otherwise, when you see multiple firms, it's often that they're doing something different. So one of the things that's very funny is you get into court and the judge, age 70, says, well, all of that, I mean, like YouTube and Facebook are substitutes for each other. And then you go home to dinner and you say to your kids, okay, what's the difference between Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and whatever else there is? And I mean, at least I know the difference between YouTube and Facebook, but a lot of courts just don't, and they think that anything that's on the internet must be a substitute for anything else. Okay, and they don't sort of appreciate that, yes, I can read a book and go skiing, and those are both uses of my time, but we don't think of those as competing substitutes in a market the way we might think about Snapchat and Instagram. Okay. So we have this competition for the market, and that means that in the best case scenario here, you get a monopoly, and then there's a challenger, and everybody switches, and you get another monopoly, and then there's a challenger, and everybody switches, okay? And the way to think about that might be AT&T, IBM, Microsoft, Google, and then question mark, okay? The question mark is where we are now. All right, the other problem that is characteristic of our environment online, which is characteristic of our offline environment also, but it ends up being on steroids here, is that we have behavioral economics really having a strong impact on consumer behavior. So this is, again, something that courts don't understand. I remember talking to a lawyer just a couple of years ago who I was telling him about behavioral, and he said, is that new? Oh my God, where do you start? So this is decades old. There are 4 Nobel Prizes. We have many, many journal papers that are from the field and from the lab, and many of you took the behavioral classes that we offered here at SOM for many years. Feel free to check your cross and change signs. What do people do? They're not the neoclassical model. They have a status quo or default bias. When something's a default, we tend to do it. This is why organ donation forms on driver's licenses, if the default is you're going to donate your organ, participation rates are 80%, and if the default is you're not, participation rates are 10%. And that's not reflecting anybody's preferences, that's just our responsiveness to defaults. Impatience and hyperbolic discounting, we want things right now, and something that arrives tomorrow is not as attractive as the same thing that arrives today. Now that's true just based on time value of money, but there's an extra penalty that people put on anything that arrives tomorrow. So tomorrow onwards, we discount properly with our rate of interest, but today to tomorrow has not just R, but an R plus theta, whatever your model is, okay? So what does that mean? It means that consumers look on the first page of search results and don't scroll on and don't test to see if they're getting the right answers. You don't multi-home on competing platforms because there's a cost to that. You don't replace default apps because that takes time and you're in a hurry to get to wherever you're going. And then when you have free time, you don't think, oh, now I'll use my free time to change my default apps. You think I'll go have a beer or something. So this makes entry very expensive because the entrant has a hard time getting the attention of the consumer because of all these defaults and other kinds of sticky consumers, okay? And so then when you have less entry, this high concentration that we just talked about persists. So it's a very, vexing problem. Like legitimately the problem is hard. And then on top of that, the platforms don't feel neutral about this. If you're an incumbent, you want to squash anybody who comes along to try to take your place. So you have an unforgiving structure, you have consumers who aren't helping, and then you have anti-competitive conduct. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about entry. Entry, again, in the courts has traditionally been thought, well, I've got to see the entrant. So I've got this small entrant, and let's say it's Tesla. They're small but I can see them, and they're a car company. Well, we have a lot of important entry that is potential entry, that's nearby, that's thinking about entering, or that's nascent, that isn't even selling lots of cars yet, but is just in the R&D phase with some venture capital, or that's entering in a nearby space that isn't a threat right now, but could become a threat later. An example I like to give people about potential entry and how hard it is to think about this in the digital context is Spotify. My kids are just addicted to Spotify. They listen to it all the time. They organize their playlists and share them and so on. Imagine if Spotify chose to put on their sharing of messages and images. Okay? They would be a social network in a week. Okay, because they have such an installed base. Now, if you went to court and you said, oh, I think that the social networking space should include Spotify, people would just laugh at you. Like, they do music, don't you understand? You know, they're a music company. They aren't the place where people talk about their vacations. So this question of where the entrant comes from is really also quite interesting and different and requires a lot of flexible thinking. Okay, so any kind of entrant is really good. Any kind of entrant makes the incumbent run faster, either because the entrant's in the market and creating choice, or threatening to be in the market and thereby creating choice. And that pushes forward innovation, differentiation, choice, and lower prices. Okay, and so that raises consumer welfare. Lack of entry comes from all the things that I just told you about: network effects, scale, myopic and inertial consumers, and then the anti-competitive conduct. Exclusive contracts, bundling, technical rules, lack of interoperability, and then, of course, acquisition of a business that appears to be a threat. So if I'm Facebook and I perceive that Instagram has done mobile better, and they do pictures better, and they're going to take over, I just buy it. Okay? And what Facebook told the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK was, oh, we do text. Instagram does pictures. So we're different. We don't compete. That's why it's okay for us to buy. Right? And the regulators believed that because they were not 15. Okay? And they were just reading the brief and thought that made sense. Okay? Well, what that means is protecting if, by the way, even in the United States, I think this is not true in the UK, but in the United States, if you hadn't believed them and gone to court, they would have spent millions and millions of dollars on economists and lawyers explaining to the 70-year-old judge that pictures are different from text and it would be fine. And they probably wouldn't have won that. Because what's the chance that Instagram's going to overthrow Facebook? It's such a small chance, very low probability, anything could happen, and so on. And what that, of course, doesn't do is create the expected value. You can have a low probability event that's really great for consumers, like Instagram creates competition, and then the way people engage with social networks becomes much better and more innovative and less violent. And so even if it's a 2% chance of that happening, that might be really good for consumers and not something you want to rule out with a merger. Okay, so all right, what are the harms from all of this? Harms are manifold and not difficult to understand, but yet the boxes we've been in the industrial age rather than the new economy age make it sometimes a little bit hard for people to see them immediately. So first, let's imagine that Facebook and Google are advertising companies. So they're selling ads. You can imagine if there isn't enough competition in ads that the price of ads is too high. All right, so that's just a harm to all the businesses who buy ads. It's also a harm to the end consumers who are eventually paying for that because the cost structure of the business reflects it. Then there are markups that consumers pay on services and devices. So let's imagine that the correct competitive price of Facebook is that I should be getting $10 a month. in payment for watching all the ads on Facebook. And instead I'm being paid $0. Okay, so that's a markup on essentially the labor. We're all the laborers for Facebook. We come to work and we watch ads, and we're given some services in exchange, okay, and then we go away again. So what's our wage? Is our wage, maybe our wage should be some dollars, maybe our wage should be higher quality services, but because the monetary price is set at $0, we're getting a markup in our purchases of social media. Devices is the same thing. If an OEM making a handset could get Android at $10 a head, and then think about which search engine they wanted to make the default. Do they want it to be Bing, or this new entrant Neva, or Google? And they could say, well, which of you would like to be the default? Because when I put you on my handset as a default, 80% of people are going to use it. Okay, some of them are going to say, oh, I don't like this search engine, Google's is better, I'm going to switch, but most people don't know how to do that. And 6 months after the search engine's default search engine on a Samsung, it's going to be a good search engine because millions of people will have used it. So the OEM has a lot of power if they have a free choice across search engines, and instead of getting a 12% revenue share, they might say, we'd like a 70% revenue share. Now, if HTC or Samsung is going to get a 70% revenue share of digital ads, instead of $250 billion going to Google, okay, that $200 billion of that's going to the owner of the handset. Now the handset maker wants to just give you a handset. Like, please, take my handset as long as you use this search engine. So we might have devices, instead of $300 devices, we might have $22 devices. And so consumers could really do well out of competition in search in a way that they're not now. It's all going to Google. Okay? Then, so that's price, kind of classic price stuff. Then there's quality. A lot of digital businesses are engaging in a barter transaction. So we come and watch ads, and they give us something in exchange for watching the ads. And what they're doing is using A/B testing, which is the process of putting the link in red versus pink, or up high versus down low, or in a box or not, or if I wait until I see that you're on the subway, is the ad more effective? Or if I know that you eat you go into this restaurant every day, that must mean you're hungry at noon, and if I show you food ads at 11:45, are they more effective, or is it 11:30, or is it 12:10? And they just do billions of these tests all the time to figure out what will get you to click, okay? And so that's not always good for consumers. It might be good to be shown a pair of shoes that you're interested in rather than vinyl siding, which you never plan to buy. But it's not so good to be sold, to have makeup being sold to depressed teenagers, which is what happens, and for people to be charged different prices depending on where they're going. All these kinds of things. So framing nudges and defaults can direct a consumer to the choice that's most profitable for the platform rather than the one they might have picked. And that includes, by the way, the platform's own businesses that are complements to the main platform. So if Google is selling something, they can put that into their search results. Okay, free. Lots and lots of people, I cannot tell you how many times I have given this little speech at mostly law events. Free is not a special zone where economics or antitrust do not apply. Lots of judges seem to think this. If we're not paying a money price for something, then how could there be a competition problem? As if we had not had competition in radio and broadcast television for decade after decade, and nobody thought that a monopoly broadcast television station was a good idea. Okay, why? Because quality goes down. So free means a money price is set at $0. And if you think about the number line, okay, the competitive price could be +2, 0, -2, -6, +25. Okay, it's just a number line. And we're at 0 because of historical accident, really. There's no micropayments. We don't have the ability for a consumer to go around the web and collect quarter of a cent kinds of prices. And so what we can have is a setting where insufficient competition causes a markup, and that markup is to 0. All right? And I think that's happening in a lot of services in the United States. And what that does is that it means that consumers are losing out either in a monetary sense or a quality sense, or both. Okay, and then the big one, probably the really big one, is harm to innovation. And why is that such a big thing? Well, when you talk to the macroeconomists, what they explain is really it's not that reallocation of resources and getting more efficient with the wood and the metal and the wire and the paper is giving us a higher standard of living. It's that we invent new stuff. It's the fact that we're not using whale oil to light our houses anymore. We're using solar panels and electricity. Okay? That's what gets us higher standards of living. And so when you have innovation that is either slow because the monopolist doesn't really face a need to innovate to keep customers, they come anyway, or controlled by that entity, okay? That's a real harm to competition. I think the example probably most of you know is when Microsoft wanted to control the internet. Remember when Microsoft tried to squash Netscape and keep the browser on the desktop and control what was going to happen in that space and make it into Microsoft's walled garden, okay? Would that have been a good outcome? Well, we got a pretty terrible outcome, but would that have been an outcome? No, we don't want that. The past monopolist is not somebody we want directing the future of innovation. That doesn't get us choices, that doesn't get us creativity, doesn't get us a whole different bunch of paths, right? So AT&T wanted to control computing, and we had an antitrust case to stop that. IBM wanted to control personal computers and software, and we had an antitrust case to stop that. Then Microsoft controlled software and wanted to control the internet, and we had an antitrust case to stop that. Now Google controls the internet and wants to move into whatever's next, and we have an antitrust case that was filed in the fall of 2020 by two of them, one by the Department of Justice and one by most of the states. Okay, so this is a critical lesson that we care about all of these prices and quality, but we really, really care about innovation. Okay, so what are the solutions? Self-correction is not going to happen. The platforms say, oh, two guys in a garage could upend us anytime, okay? If somebody tries that on you, just say, no, that's just wrong, okay? It's wrong. And that's because of the economies of scale and the network effects, so it's just wrong. So we have antitrust and regulation. Having not enforced against these platforms for a long time, now we have entrenched monopolies. What do we do about that? We can file antitrust cases against them. We have not done that in the United States. The Europeans have. We didn't start until 2 years ago. And we have no regulator in this space at all. We have no regulation and no regulator at all. And that, when you think about that, it's a little odd. Like you invent pharmaceuticals, you make a regulator. You invent airplanes, you make a regulator. You invent communications, you get the Federal Communications Commission. You invent cars, we do things like have seatbelts and crash tests and driver's licenses and things that make the cars better for society rather than just totally unmitigated, unregulated, do whatever you want cars, okay? But that's what the internet is now. Digital businesses have nobody looking after them. Okay, so why is antitrust a difficult solution? It's difficult because the U.S. antitrust environment has been steadily getting worse for the last approximately 40 years. And so we've got, the markets have tipped, economies of scale are large, so even in the best case, antitrust enforcement is not going to get us vibrant competition, not going to get us fragmented markets. But for the last 40 years, antitrust enforcement has generated decisions by judges that are really based on outdated learning. They're like, they took the neoclassical consumer and put them in a world of homogeneous steel factories, okay? And just used all of that kind of back of the envelope reasoning to deliver court decisions. So you can't have any predation unless price is below marginal cost. Well, what if marginal cost is zero? Does that mean there's no predation? Not at all. We can engage in predation in that kind of market. But in the US, you can't bring that case because a court said that as long as price is above marginal cost, everything's fine. So there's a lot of cases like that where courts just don't seem to have ever been in the business world and thought about how businesses actually work and what cost structures are. And so, and also courts have a very hard time thinking that anything large companies do is a harm to competition. One of the, I think, hallmarks of the conservative jurists in the United States today is, notwithstanding decisions like yesterday's, a general enthusiasm for giving more power to corporations. So that's why we have mandatory arbitration in many situations, and employees cannot file an antitrust case, for example, to say, where I'm being paid too little because you merged with the other employer in my neighborhood. No, you have to go to mandatory arbitration. So there's lots of things like the mandatory arbitration example that have shifted the balance of power towards corporations, and antitrust is one of those. Let's find lots of different ways to say that whatever the large incumbent is doing is fine. Okay, so some of these things that courts assume away include behavioral biases. Consumers can just switch, and that's an assumption, not borne out by the data or consumer behavior. Quality, not bothering to think about quality in light of zero money prices. If I'm bartering with you and getting zero money, really the thing that's interesting is quality, because that's how I'm being paid. So we really need to care about it. The significant impact of these potential competitors and nascent competitors, the court would say, well, they're not here, they don't matter, they're nascent, they can't really be doing anything because they're just so small. Really strict ideas about market definition that again require, that limit what plaintiffs can do, and also aren't, again, reflective of the ways in which the digital environment's very plastic. So again, Spotify trying to be a social network, that would be pretty easy. There's lots of really interesting ways to think about market definition and how hard it is that make our old-fashioned market definition, as baby food in the same market as cereal. Well, no, it's not. We have a breakfast cereal market and a baby food market. But if we talk about digital businesses, it's a lot harder to draw those lines, and it becomes much more confusing, and you have to just live with that. I mean, it's uncertain, and that's how it is. You can't say, well, let's not do antitrust enforcement because there's uncertainty. That's a little bit where we are. And this problem comes up because of the question about whether you've got a complement or a substitute. So I gave you the example of Spotify because Spotify is a complement to a platform. It's a music service. It's a thing you can do on your handset. Okay, but then it could suddenly become a social network. Or if a social network is strong enough, maybe it could become an app like WeChat, and then a WeChat app on which people had lots of social activity and commercial activity and so on could be such a home for consumers that it could sponsor another operating system. Because like Java was platform agnostic in the Microsoft case, and Windows was really worried that Java would sponsor another operating system and people could just run their app on the new one because they only cared about Java. If everybody's on WeChat and there's a new entrant and it supports WeChat, people can move over very easily. So these kinds of complements becoming substitutes and sponsoring new entry is really fun to think about, but kind of a nightmare if you're trying to do antitrust. Okay, so this slide just said. Okay, so antitrust also necessarily looks back. It's law enforcement. We're now in fall of 2020, and we are going to announce, the Department of Justice is going to announce that we think that Google broke the antitrust laws last year and the year before and the year before. Okay? So now it doesn't do anything about going forward, just we have to wait for people to break the law, and then after they've broken the law, and by the way, the platform is tipped and they become the winner, some years after that, we'll decide, oh gosh, look, that wasn't so good, and then we'll sue them, and then that takes another 5 years. And then what's the remedy at the end of that time? Right? You can't, it's really hard to change market structure at that point because the market tipped, then you noticed it tipped, then you sued, then it took a long time to sue, and now the thing is completely entrenched. All right? So ceasing the behavior that caused the tipping isn't going to do anything. A fine isn't going to do anything. You can have divestiture that improves market structure, and that's a really good thing. So you could have, for example, Facebook divesting Instagram and WhatsApp. It doesn't do anything for Facebook.com. Facebook.com still hosts the Yale Class of 2023 webpage, and schools, and high school friends, and the soccer team, and you can't get away from it. Okay, that doesn't help you, but Instagram could be in a different company from Facebook. That would do a little bit to allow competition. Another one that would help a lot would be Google divesting Android, because again, then if you're an OEM, you would have an independent company that you could get an operating system from, and you could decide whether you wanted maps and search from Google or from somebody else, and they would be all tied together. Okay, so that would be very helpful. But the bottom line of this talk, and I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, is that we really need regulation as a complement to antitrust enforcement. Because antitrust enforcement takes so long, and you can only do really big things. You can't do small exclusionary conduct, tiny activities that these platforms carry out every week. You can't bring all of those antitrust cases. So you need regulation for a couple of reasons. One, all of that other conduct, and two, you're going to have to implement whatever remedy the court decides to give in the Google and Facebook cases if we are so fortunate as to win them. So for example, I told you the divestiture would be good, but what would we do with Facebook.com? My personal view on what we should do with Facebook.com is mandatory interoperability. So think about your email. You have an ISP. It might be Hotmail, it might be Gmail, it might be one you run yourself. You can email anyone else who's got a different ISP, right? Those email ISPs interoperate, and your email can be read by anybody with a different one. That's not the way Facebook.com operates. If I want to see posts from my college roommates, I have to be on Facebook.com. I can't have a separate host, social network, where I could say I would like to receive messages from my friends. They would agree that they're my friends, and then my host could filter that content and maybe get rid of violence, maybe get rid of political stuff, maybe make it more safe for children, maybe not show me ads and have a different business model, a subscription model or something. So you could imagine that if we could share social messages in this way, there'd be a lot more entry and innovation in content moderation, in the business model of pricing it, and then people could vote with their feet. If they liked Facebook's content moderation, they could stay there. If they didn't, they could go to a different social network and still get messages from the school. Okay. So that's, I think, a very good idea, but if you had that, how would you oversee it? Because you could be sure Facebook would not like it, and there would be accidental breakdowns in the APIs on Mother's Day and important times when people want to talk to each other. So you'd need an antitrust authority or a regulatory authority to oversee that remedy. And when technology changes quickly, law enforcement is very good at that, and so then you're going to really end up wanting a regulator. You want a regulator like we have the Federal Communications Commission or NHTSA, the traffic people, specialist skills. They can act very quickly if there's some problem with an aircraft that isn't safe or a car that isn't safe. They can hear about it on Monday and have a meeting about it on Tuesday and bring the firms in on Wednesday and generally be pretty quick. There's also a fun thing, which is the reputation and history of the platform matters. That is to say, if every time you have an antitrust case, which is not that often, you go to a different judge, and that judge is like, they do one antitrust case every 10 years, so they don't even remember antitrust, let alone what you said last week. Whereas if you go in front of the Federal Communications Commission and you're a cable operator and you tell them A, B, and C, the next month you can't tell them not A, not B, and not C, because they're going to remember what you said from the previous month and are going to say, hang on a second, that can't be right. So there's an element, the regulator has a history and some ability to keep the regulated firms honest. Okay, so what could a regulator do? Interoperability, access requirements more generally, data portability if consumers want to take their stuff from one platform to another. If data sharing is required, if we decide, like the Europeans have done, that Google has to share click and query data with entering search engines so that they can train their algorithms to be better. It could look after that. Non-discrimination requirements. If Amazon's going to sell Amazon toaster and another toaster, they need to treat them in a symmetric fashion, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's what you could give a regulator to do. Now, what is the prospect for regulation? Well, there's proposed regulation in the United States and enacted regulation in Europe. Europe just passed the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act this spring of 22. So that's partly why this is very exciting stuff for me and for other economists who work in the competition area, because we have a thing to study. And they're going to be regulating the biggest 5 platforms along a lot of dimensions, and we have very few answers. So we need to get moving, doing more research, and being able to help regulators. So in the US, the idea is to define a covered platform, and a covered platform is basically large, lots of business users, lots of end users, and also is a trading partner, a necessary trading partner, which, and the definition of that is, if the platform were to cease trading with somebody that would cause that person significant commercial harm, political harm, or social harm. So that gets you a whole bunch of, basically, at least it's a pretty intuitive definition. It leads to who you think you're going to get. In the European Union, their gatekeeper core platform service, the gatekeeper, again, has to be large, but it's just a numerical test, that's it. And the way they pick the numbers, we think there are going to be about 15 gatekeepers, but we think that the only reason they went past the first 5 was so they couldn't be accused of only targeting American firms. And the only firms that they really want to regulate are Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. So that will be who gets regulated, and the rest of them will file a rebuttal saying we really should be regulated, and probably those will be accepted. So it'll be just the big platforms in Europe also. What does the Digital Markets Act say? It forbids tying core platform services together. So for example, Android could not require an OEM to use search, or Google could not require a user to log into Chrome in order to access some services. It allows business users to essentially disintermediate the platform, and what that's really about are apps. So if you're Spotify, you want to be able to sell someone a Spotify subscription on the website, communicate with them by email, and let them listen to their music on their handset. Okay, and that means that Apple does not get a 30% cut of that subscription, and Apple does not get to stop Spotify from communicating with its own users, which right now Apple does in the name of privacy. And sometimes that's right. If I buy a Faces of the Moon app, I don't really want to talk to the developer of that app. But if I buy the New York Times, then I'd like the New York Times to be able to tell me about specials or events or something. Right? And right now that's just not allowed. So that's so the apps can disintermediate the platforms. The DMA also bans most favored nation clauses, MFNs, which those of you who took my class have seen. So that would be when, let's say, Google Play or the Apple Store would say, if you're selling in our store at $12 a month, you can't sell anywhere else for less. And if the platform's going to take a 30% fee, you might well want to sell at $10 in the platform and $7 somewhere else because then that's the same profit margin for you. So the MFN, the platforms are not allowed to use MFNs. That also really matters for hotels and travel sites. The travel site takes often a 20 or 30% commission, and so the hotels would like to say, I'm charging $100 on Booking.com and 100 euros on Booking.com and 70 euros on my own website. And Booking doesn't like that. The big one, probably that's easy to understand for all of us, is the equal access to hardware and software features of the operating system. What does that mean? It means that Apple and Google have to allow rival stores, app stores. They have to allow rival wallets. Okay, that there isn't any functionality of the OS that the owner of the OS can keep and let its own applications use and not let rival applications use. Okay, that's a very big deal. Apple really does not want to allow another Play Store because they take 30% of all the sales in the Play Store, and that turns out to be quite a bit of money. And same for Google. And then the DMA also forbids the use of a business user data to compete with that business user, and this is responsive to the Amazon complaint, the complaint by merchants on Amazon that Amazon was watching what was being sold and then using that data to launch their own competing product that harmed the business users. So now either that will have to be made public so everyone can see it and use it, or Amazon will have to not collect it or not allow anybody inside the phone to look at it. Okay, so those are specific things that the DMA does. In general, we want the regulator to create conditions conducive to competition. And in Europe, they call this contestability. Contestability and fairness are the goals of the DMA. They're going to collect a lot of data. They're going to make a lot of it public. They're going to, I think, partner with some academics and researchers to study the stuff that's not public to help the regulator do a better job. They're going to oversee data portability, which is required under the law, and interoperability of messaging is also required under the law. So messaging apps that belong to the covered platforms, and I think that means iMessage, WhatsApp, and Facebook Messenger, will have to be interoperable. That is to say, entering messengers that want to link up can. Let me note that this does not require anybody to link up who doesn't want to. If your signal and your thing is security and you don't want to interoperate with WhatsApp, you don't have to. The obligation falls on WhatsApp and iMessage and Facebook Messenger. And then there's most of this would be in the DSA, the Digital Service Act, but the behavioral side of this is really important for the regulator. The regulator has to make sure that if the law says consumers may choose which default search engine they want, that choice is a real one. That it's not that there's a default and it's easy to use the default and really hard to pick something else. Or that the something else's are ordered by how much they paid Google. Or that the something else's are ordered by how many ads they show and the nastiest ones are at the top, or anything like that. Okay? And then we can do even better going forward in new areas with some openness regulations. So again, this interoperability like we see in email. Imagine if you can set up a standard for micropayments, we could have a lot of more diverse business models out there. If digital identities were established in a way that did not create market power, we could do a lot better with artificial intelligence and virtual reality and the metaverse and so on, because we could control like who we're actually talking to. The Internet of Things, your TV is essentially controlled by Google, and that makes it hard to get innovation and new ideas into the home because those devices are already captured. And they're durable, and we're not all going to go out and buy a new fridge just because we don't like Google. So those kinds of devices are a problem. Okay, so here's the problem. We're not doing anything in the United States. Our antitrust sucks, and we're not regulating. So we are all going to be suffering under these monopolies for the foreseeable future. I guess after the 4th of July, there's a short window in which the Senate might, because Schumer has 2 daughters, one works for Facebook, one works for Google, so it's not clear that there's going to be a vote on this regulation. But if there is, there are some Republicans who want to regulate digital platforms, so we might have a vote, but if that week goes by and there's no vote, then I think you're looking at 10 years or something before anything happens. So that'll be very American. And I'm spending the fall in the UK, and I can't wait. Lots of gun control and good healthcare there. But what will be interesting, because the United States is not doing anything here, and Europe is, and Europe has 400 million rich people in it, digital platforms are going to have to think very carefully about what their strategy is. Because let's say Apple has to open up the wallet, and there's cool fintech applications that people in Europe, that get launched in Europe and people use, and they're really fun and it's useful. And people in Germany have an iPhone with cool fintech applications on it. If that person in Germany comes to New York for a business trip, is the fintech application going to work in New York? If it doesn't, that's what Apple would call a poor user experience. Okay, Apple does not like poor user experiences. But if the fintech thing works in the United States, then all of us are going to fly to Germany for vacation and buy an iPhone when we're there, because we want to do all the things that the European iPhone does, which our American iPhone does not do. So if you run an exploitative business model in the US and a competitive one in Europe, it's going to create conflict, because people are going to pretend they're European or go buy devices there or whatever. So that's, you can imagine that different platforms will have a different response to that problem. Do you want to run the same thing globally or not? We also need to keep an eye on the Korean Fair Trade Commission and the Japanese Fair Trade Commission, both of which have considerable interest in this kind of regulation also. The Koreans because of Samsung, and the Japanese just because they're interested. So they're starting to pass laws like you have to allow other app stores on the handset. And so then if you've got Korea and Japan and Europe and maybe Canada and New Zealand and Australia, you're going to have a China solution, a rest of world good solution, and then the American exploitative solution. So that's my prediction for the future. And yeah, so there are downsides. I've spoken very favorably about both antitrust enforcement and regulation. There's definitely downsides to both of those things. In my research, and a lot of the literature really shows, however, that we are way off of the optimal point, that we need more of both of those. You could overshoot, but we're nowhere close to overshooting at the moment. Antitrust works well when agencies are quick and courts enforce the law well, and we don't have either of those. And even if we did, we'd need regulation on top of it, as Europe is showing. And part of what a regulator can do that I haven't talked about at all are things like privacy, violence, addiction, media plurality. You can give a regulator whatever goals you want in a democracy, provided we have one, of course. You can give the regulator whatever goals you want as a society. So you could say, we want the digital regulator to do some interoperability and some non-discrimination, but we also want content moderators to have to show that they're not addicting children, and we have to give platforms have to give users tools that are easy to use where they can turn off violence and pick the happy setting in their social media, or the angry setting if they want, I guess. So that's the kind of thing that you can also do with regulation. And so those two policy instruments between them can deliver healthy competition, and we've seen that in a lot of sectors historically in the United States. We're not doing that now, but it is happening in Europe, which will be fun to watch. Okay, so that's my prepared content, and now I'd be interested in your questions or comments. Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan Katana, class of 2012. Question for you with regards to the history of introducing regulatory bodies into industries. How do you design, is the gatekeeper sort of definition enough to prevent the risk of regulatory capture that further entrenches the incumbent competition just through the cost of complying with some of these regulations?
Right. So this is why one of the things that we care a lot about from the regulator is facilitating open standards. You want to say, if you're going to set up a regulation, the goal of this regulation is a pro-competitive regulation. That's why the European Union's DMA is nice, because their twin goals are contestability and fairness. And by contestability, they basically mean no entry barriers. So if one of the goals that you set the regulator is no entry barriers, then that's really helpful. Now, as to capture, this gets brought up all the time, and the answer is, we're fully captured right now. It can't get worse, okay? So if we had a regulator that just did what the platforms wanted, well, we're in the world where we're doing what the platforms want. So I really don't get that argument at all. There's some hope of democratic accountability if you have a regulator who says you're supposed to be doing A, B, and C. I mean, sometimes A, B, and C are observable. Like if there's supposed to be more app stores on the phone and there aren't, then we can say, gosh, it doesn't look like you're complying with the regulation. So there's a limit, I think, to how captured a regulator can get. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mark Semmel, 07. Good to see you again.
Yeah. Everybody looks a little older.
A little Are you aware of what's going on in the EU regarding intellectual property? Because I know Google has been lobbying for years to weaken that, and have they done anything better?
This is what they're going to try, of course. My algorithm is my intellectual property, my API is my intellectual property, so any interoperability or any, examination of my algorithm to see if it's fair or not is all going to be a violation.
It's all trade secret to them, and they don't want to disclose it. The small guys patent it.
I don't think it's going to work with the courts over there in the sense that if the DMA says, look, you have to be non-discriminatory in your search results, and the regulators obviously got to look at what you're doing to evaluate that law. That's not a threat to your intellectual property, it's checking if you're complying with the law. So I think it'll be more in areas like interoperability, where the API then has to be shared with somebody else. Or if there's any aspect of the law, which I don't know of, that would require an entity to share its algorithm with another entity.
All this stuff is not observable, which is what I was thinking more about, like, you can challenge a patent now before it gets awarded. They started that in Europe, and now they're adding it to the US. So there's no jury trial, there's no whole, they can stop it in its tracks before it even gets to.
Yeah. I mean, the basic problem we have with patents is there are too many of them that are too much crap. So again, the pendulum is very far in the pro-patent direction, and getting rid of a whole bunch of patents would, I think, be excellent. So I'm not in the Qualcomm camp on this one at all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Hi, I had a question about content moderation with interoperability. You spoke a little bit about like the happy mode and making it easy for the consumer. But content moderation on social media just brings me back to like Trump's tweets or potential Russian influence in elections and stuff like that. So if there's a feature where there is interoperability where you can access tweets on platforms other than Twitter, how does speech, like free speech, play into that? Can you just make, let's say Twitter says you can't look at Trump's tweets, can you just make a platform where you can, and it's just, there is no overseeing body on that sort of thing? Or would that go?
Yeah, so the reason that I think that the multiple hosts is a good solution is because it exactly gets away from free speech. So think about it, the easier way to think about it in the Facebook context is imagine that we told Facebook, you're now just a dumb pipe. Everyone puts their stuff in there, but you, Facebook, are not allowed to be a host. You're not allowed to have accounts for people to access the network. We're going to have a whole new industry, and people sign up, and I'm going to sign up for, let's say, the Consumer Reports content moderation. The Consumer Reports content moderation is going to say, here, do not sign up unless you want us, and here's what we're going to do. Nothing we can figure out is false, nothing hateful, nothing racist, no Ku Klux Klan, nothing like that. And then we're going to put a heavy weight on your friends or something like that. And that's what you're going to see. And that would be the thing Consumer Reports is selling. There would be like MAGA or Us site that would say, yeah, we're going to give you all that stuff. But you can't, with the free speech rules we have, you can't stop people from like saying that stuff or wanting to consume it. The issue is, can the people who are, like the innocent suburban people who now believe in QAnon, because they were just on Facebook doing their soccer and neighborhood stuff, and then the QAnon people infiltrated that and converted them, okay? That's something you don't want to have happen to you. and you'd like to belong to a social media site that gave you what you wanted. You could imagine Disney opening a site and having something squeaky clean for kids, okay? And then they wouldn't get their crazy aunt who has an AK-47. They would never see those messages. And if you didn't want that, like I'm allowed to subscribe to the magazines I want to see and talk to the people I want. No one can force their speech on me. They're allowed to have it, but I don't have to listen to it. Right? So that's the route I'm trying to go.
Follow up on that, what effect do you think that would potentially have on the further polarization of political echo chambers that have already started to happen on social media where...
Oh, I think we're almost at the max on that, and that what this would do is it would stop the QAnon thing, right? So there's a literature in sociology. Is it worse to put the crazy people in the same pool with everybody else on the grounds that they'll learn from everybody else, or do we want to segregate them on the grounds that they're harming everybody else? Right? And I think in this country we've learned the answer to that, okay? And we want to put them all in their own cesspool together, talking to each other, and that will be fun.
Is there any credible discussion about specialized courts, right? We have maritime courts, we have drug courts.
Yeah, yeah.
What?
An antitrust court, so I actually like that idea. One of the problems with the patent court is that after a number of decades on it, they get kind of captured.
Yeah.
So I think the sweet spot might be a specialized court where you serve for, let's say, 7 years or 6. So you come off the federal bench, you do antitrust for 7 years, and then you go back to the federal bench. Because it only takes your third antitrust case before you go, okay, market shares, I get the idea. HHIs, I square them and add them up, got the idea. Hypothetical monopolist test, now I've seen my third one. So then you would get much more sophisticated decisions that would be better, but you don't want a judge who says, well, when you run your Barry Levinson-Pecos model, I have a certain view of the error structure, and I think you should have, random coefficients on the demographics. You don't really want a judge doing that because that's too much. But I think it's a great idea.
And you might be able to get to market faster than regulation. Yeah.
You might go a little faster and you might get more sensible outcomes just because people would be, the whole confuse the judge strategy is a very effective litigation strategy, and it would just be harder to do if the judge was a bit more of an expert in antitrust. So you might get better answers. Yeah.
Hi, Doug Williams, class of 2017. Is there any hope, action at the state level, kind of like the California privacy law that went into effect recently? Is there any latitude for them to put in laws that would?
Yes, New York has this abuse of dominance law. They modeled after Europe, but it's, I think, even stricter than Europe's, that they're trying to get through. I don't think it's going to happen. But California and New York are the two states to watch. They're the two states where the Attorney General's office has a dedicated antitrust bureau, and they bring real cases and are leaders in the multi-state cases. And I've worked with both of those states, and I think very highly of them. Legislatively, the California privacy law, I'm not sure how we're thinking about it exactly. What I've not heard complaining from firms saying, oh, it's working like auto emissions and we all have to comply with it, nor have I really heard about other states trying to build on it in a way that would either extend it or help. We have to be careful. If lots of liberal states do lots of different versions of privacy law, that will drive the platforms into Washington, and Mitch McConnell will give them some basement level thing that supersedes all of that. So it's a little tricky to think about what's happening.
Is it worth asking the question if competition in general is good, then are some of the activities that we're discussing restricting competition on thought? So I know you argue for putting the QAnon folks in their own cesspool, but couldn't you also argue that but shining daylight on them and having increased, so if I'm here telling you that QAnon's the greatest thing ever, which I'm not 100% sure I even know exactly what it is, but if I were to make that argument, you could also in front of all of these folks say, no, for these various reasons, you're out of your mind.
Yep.
And by shining light on it and having increased thought, rather than getting into these thought silos, wouldn't we further increase
So,
mankind?
again, I think we did that experiment, and because the way Facebook works is they want you to stay on the platform longer, because remember, you're the worker watching the ads. It turns out the way to get someone to stay on the platform is outrage. Outrage is it's the lower brainstem, and it makes you stay and watch more.